Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Deverly, and Bridget Glenn Spears and I are going to be presenting this afternoon on some COVID-19 related safety and health issues. We're glad you could join us today. And I want to start out by thanking our colleagues Eric Pinkett and Kelly Hill. Eric is in our IT department, and Kelly helps with all the organizational aspects of our webinars, and it's thanks to them that we are able to present this program for you today. To give you an overview of the topics we're going to cover, I'm going to cover the Occupational Safety and Health Act and the related requirements on employers and the issues that come out of that. And Bridget is going to tell us about the discrimination-related aspects of our two topics today, which are masks and vaccines. And when we talk about the discrimination issues, mostly they arise out of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that act, of course, is enforced by the EEOC. The Osha Act is enforced by Osha at the federal level, and in 22 states by state agencies, 22 states, including South Carolina, North Carolina, where our state agencies have jurisdiction for safety and health issues over most public and private employers in the state. On the OSHA developments, the Biden administration, when it came into office, issued, or they had OSHA issue revised guidance on COVID-19. And also they issued a national emphasis program, putting emphasis on hiring new inspectors to go out and inspect employers, especially healthcare employers, not just hospitals, but doctors' offices and nursing homes and those kind of employers. And they've also been working on an emergency temporary standard related to COVID-19 that may or may not be coming out. But the most recent issue involving employee safety and health is the mask issue. Because rather suddenly, a couple of weeks ago, about a week and a half ago, the CDC said for people who are fully vaccinated, they no longer need to wear a mask. Now, the CDC doesn't have jurisdiction over the workplace, so employers need to pay attention to OSHA on that issue. But OSHA said they were basically kind of reevaluating their guidance, and they were going to go with CDC recommendations for now. But you know, that is something that is subject to change. The OSHA guidance that is currently on the books, active, dates from January 29, and it you know, strongly encourages employers to make sure that employees are wearing masks at work. I've got a couple slides that try to put COVID-19 in some kind of historical perspective. And on this slide, you can see of the four most destructive and disruptive events of the 20th century, the 1918 flu pandemic ranked second as far as number of deaths. And thankfully, due to advances in healthcare and vaccine development, the current pandemic has been much less deadly, and it caused a lot of havoc on, well, it is still causing havoc on economies around the world. The U.S. economy is coming back as COVID cases go down. COVID cases have gone down significantly since January, when they were at their all-time high. Currently in South Carolina and North Carolina, we're only having about 15% as many new daily cases as we had in January. But COVID still hasn't gone away. The vaccine rollout has been more successful in the United States than in most other countries. You see down there at the bottom, 40% of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated. It's just slightly lower than that in North Carolina and a little lower than that even in South Carolina. And we're still getting daily cases around, I think the 7-day average for South Carolina is 300 plus, and for North Carolina is 800 plus. So COVID hasn't gone away, but it is becoming more under control. The vaccines that are available in the United States right now, as I'm sure you all know, are the Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. AstraZeneca is approved for use in the United Kingdom, where it's the main vaccine that's been used, and that's the UK and the United States are two of the countries around the world that have had the most successful vaccine rollouts. AstraZeneca will be approved in the United States shortly. They're done with all their clinical trials, and they're waiting emergency use authorization in the US. Novavax is still in phase 3. And they're expected to eventually get approval. The best news about these vaccines is that even though new variants and mutations have come along on the virus that causes COVID-19, as you can see from this chart and from other information, COVID-19, well, the virus has not been successful against the vaccines that are currently in use, or the ones, the two that are still waiting to come into use. The reason to, not throw your mask away yet is that we don't know how long the antibodies from these vaccines last. Hopefully it's for years, but nobody knows right now because the vaccines are just going back to the clinical trials. It was last fall. So at the most, people have had these vaccines for about 6 months or so. So hopefully they're going to, the antibodies are going to prove to last a long time, but we'll have to wait and see. And also, as I said, these vaccines have been effective against the variants that are out there so far. These vaccines were developed in a way so that if boosters are needed to deal with new variants or to prolong the effect of the vaccine against the virus, they can be, as I understand it as a non-scientist, they can easily be tweaked for that purpose. And as we know, there's variants. Some of them, one of them, the one from India, is called the double mutant variant, which sounds really bad. And as of last week, it was discovered in South Carolina. It hasn't been found in North Carolina, I believe. But again, the vaccines are working, and that's great news. This is an old headline, but I like to remind myself of it. This headline is from March of last year, before the new coronavirus had been labeled COVID-19. And this article made the point that that even when COVID-19 goes away, we need to be prepared for the fact that viral outbreaks like COVID-19 are going to become more common. And according to this article, they're going to become more common because there's more urbanization, more people are living in cities, in some big cities all stacked on top of each other. And there's a lot more international travel now than there used to be. So it's more easy for viruses to to spread. This article also points out that just since the year 2000, so in just the last 21 years, there have been several of these viral outbreaks like SARS and MERS and other things. These are acronyms, of course. At least SARS and MERS are respiratory diseases. There was another one called H1N1, also referred to as the swine flu, which was in 2009, and it was also declared a pandemic, but it did not affect us in the United States all that much. And these are a couple of graphics that went with that Wall Street Journal article that just showed the increase in the number of people living in urban areas and in airline traffic between the US and China. China, as you know, it's been in the news the last couple of days, has been identified as the source of COVID-19 by our intelligence agencies. And most companies that are out there have part of their supply chain goes back to China, and many companies today send American employees back and forth to China as part of their production process. And so as long as that continues, the threat of more COVID-19 kinds of diseases is going to be there. So let's talk a little about Occupational Safety and Health Act. This law has a general duty clause, kind of a catch-all standard, so to speak, that requires every employer to keep its workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. And of course, the spread of COVID-19 at work is a recognized hazard. It has happened at many workplaces. And there is an easy way to prevent that from happening, which is to follow CDC recommendations, many of which have turned into OSHA requirements. The CDC, of course, has no jurisdiction over the workplace. OSHA does, but most of what OSHA has said to employers about how to keep your employees safe during this pandemic has been based on CDC recommendations. And beyond the general duty clause, the Occupational Safety and Health Act provides for OSHA to develop standards that apply to kind of specific issues to keep employees safe and healthy. And the standards that are kind of most applicable in the COVID-19 context are the standard on filling out your OSHA 300 logs, the record keeping and reporting, PPE, personal protective equipment, respiratory protection for some of the types of masks that are used, and you see the other standards that are listed here. Importantly, and this is really important to the new administration, the Osha Act contains a non-retaliation clause. So if employees complain about your safety standards in your work site, especially as related to COVID-19, you've got to be careful how you respond to them, because if they think that they are being retaliated against for raising a health concern, they can, basically bring a whistleblower claim. And as I say, the new administration is really interested in investigating whistleblower claims, whether or not they have any validity. And so that's the reason to be careful about how to react to employees who raise these kinds of concerns. So the day after President Biden was sworn into office, the day he was sworn in and the day after, he signed a stack of executive orders, and the day after he was sworn in is when he signed the order that affects us as employment lawyers. In that order, he directed OSHA to revise the guidance on COVID-19 that had been issued by the prior administration, and he ordered OSHA to consider whether they need to adopt an emergency temporary standard on COVID-19 and to issue it by March 15, which of course that deadline has come and gone, but the White House still has an emergency temporary standard that OSHA developed under consideration. And the executive order also directed OSHA to beef up its enforcement efforts and to conduct more inspections kind of focused on COVID-19 related issues, compliance with the general duty clause and with some of those other specific standards that we mentioned. And it says to pay special attention to retaliation, alleged retaliation against employees who complain about safety. So in response to the executive order, on January 29, OSHA issued revised guidance on preventing the spread of COVID-19 at work. And these next three slides just kind of hit the highlights of that guidance. And what is in blue font is what is new from the Biden administration. So what they did was they took the last administration's guidance and kind of added on to it. And what they added on is in blue. And you'll see that one of the things that they added on was for employers to provide face masks to employees. And I realize face masks has gotten politicized as an issue. That's really too bad, because they are very effective at preventing the spread of this disease. And that is what the CDC has been telling us from day one. The new OSHA guidance also encourages employers to let employees work from home. That's more of an ADA issue that Bridget will talk about. The ADA, of course, requires providing reasonable accommodations to employees if they're a qualified individual with a disability and they need an accommodation or in order to do their work. Some employees will ask for the ability to do telework as a accommodation, and then the decision that will have to be made at the employer is whether or not that's a reasonable request. Going to the last bullet point here, again, as I said, a lot more emphasis in the new administration on kind of taking up the cause of employees who say they have been retaliated against for raising safety concerns at work. And then the new guidance talks about COVID-19 vaccines, and it talks about on the second big bullet point there, requiring face masks for physical distancing, even for employees who are vaccinated. That, of course, doesn't square exactly with what the CDC said on May the 13th, and we'll talk more about that later. At the time that this guidance was issued, as you can see on that second bullet point, second sub-bullet point, it was not yet clear whether vaccines permitted giving the infection to somebody else, even though they protect you as the person who receives the vaccine. Now, studies that have just been done recently, studies of healthcare workers, have shown that the COVID-19 vaccines prevent the person who receives the vaccine from getting sick and prevents that person from being able to transmit the disease. So this OSHA guidance is a little out of date now, as the CDC has recognized, but I'll be talking more about that later when I talk specifically about the latest CDC guidance on mask requirements and how on masking and how the CDC guidance is affecting what OSHA is saying. The national emphasis program that the president called for in his executive order was issued in the middle of March, and the bottom line is this just requires OSHA to hire a bunch more inspectors. The money to hire them was provided for in the stimulus package that was passed about a week after this in March. It gave OSHA a lot more money to hire a lot more inspectors. It directed the state OSHA agencies, like we have in South Carolina, North Carolina, to do to basically adopt this national emphasis on hiring new inspectors and doing a lot more inspections than were done under the previous administration. And you see here it says instructs area offices to step up on-site inspections. Last year, because we were dealing with a more serious COVID situation than we're dealing with right now, OSHA was doing a lot of inspections without going on site, like sending questionnaires for employers to fill out when the agency got a complaint. But the new directive is to do more on-site inspections. And there are basically two lists of target industries for the new inspections. And the first list is all employers in the healthcare field, and not just hospitals, but offices of doctors and dentists. And you can see the list here, including nursing homes down toward the bottom. So if you're one of these employers, you're going to want to make sure that you are ready for an inspection to take place in case your place of employment is targeted by the agency. And then there's a second list of target industries that most prominently includes meat processors. Those, as we all know from watching the news for the last year, those are employers where COVID-19 transmission within the workplace has tended to be fairly high because of how close beside each other people in meat processing plants tend to work. At the same time, OSHA issued guidance for its inspectors on, trying to get them to be a little more aggressive when they do these inspections, is the bottom line. As far as the emergency temporary standard is concerned, I've got two headlines here for you. One's from April and one's from almost 2 weeks ago. And the one back in the middle of April was saying that the emergency temporary standard is expected soon. The one from, I guess it was last week, I think this would have been last Thursday, May the 20th, said that with the CDC's new guidance on mask wearing, that fully vaccinated people no longer need to wear a mask because the mask really doesn't add any protection for them that they don't already have from the vaccine. There's now, speculation that the new administration will not issue an emergency temporary standard because the mask mandate was expected to be kind of one of the central features of the standard. And with the CDC now kind of asking what's the use of masks for people who are fully vaccinated, it may be hard for OSHA to show that there is a true emergency need for a standard that requires that. Of course, the argument going the other way, and this is what employers are wrestling with right now, is that, for example, in South Carolina, I think 32 or 33% of the population is fully vaccinated. In North Carolina, I think it's around 38%, maybe a little bit lower than that. So if you have like a manufacturing plant, you already know that at least 60% of your employees are not fully vaccinated. So if you allow them to take off their masks, of course, if you're running a manufacturing plant, you don't have time to run around figuring out who's been fully vaccinated or not. So yeah, there is a question whether you'd be in compliance with the general duty clause if you drop the mask requirement. And like if you run a grocery store chain, it's not just 60% of your own employees that statistically are not fully vaccinated. It's like 60% of all your customers are not either. So that's, creating something of a dilemma for employers. This was the stimulus package I referred to. It added $100 million to OSHA's budget to enhance their enforcement activities, which again, in plain English means hiring more inspectors and sending them out to inspect employers. The American Rescue Plan Act also provides a tax credit for employers who provide paid leave for their employees who need to take time to go get a vaccine, because it always takes some time to leave work and go get the vaccine and then come back. OSHA has about 10 specific industry guidance alerts. These were all written up around last summer, and they don't have a whole lot of teeth to them. They say mostly things that are kind of obvious. And this one is for the long-term care industry. If you're in an industry where one of these alerts was issued, even though the alert doesn't say a whole lot, you definitely want to make sure that you're in compliance with it, because if you're not, that could very well support a general duty clause violation, alleged violation. OSHA issued some guidance back last May that has been reaffirmed recently about OSHA cases, about COVID-19 cases that are work-related being recordable. These are cases that result in death, days away from work, or medical treatment beyond first aid. The trick is figuring out if somebody got COVID at work or not. So in other words, if somebody's illness is work-related or not. And the agency provided some factors to look at in making a decision whether or not an employee who got sick at work, whether an employee who got sick at work or at home or someplace other than work. And you've got to go through those factors to determine whether or not your case is recordable. So one other thing, and this was just a few days ago, this was last Friday. OSHA came out with new guidance that says if an employee gets sick from taking the COVID-19 vaccine, that is not a recordable event. They had come out with guidance a month ago saying it is a recordable event if the employer requires vaccination, not if the employer merely recommends vaccination. And that turned out to be a little too difficult for employers to figure out when a situation like this was recordable or not. So OSHA basically kind of backtracked on this question. And again, this was just a few days ago. So you've all heard about the CDC guidance on masks now. It came out on May the 13th, and it applies to people who are who are fully vaccinated, and it was based on a new study of like 4,000 healthcare workers who got no additional, they were fully vaccinated, they got no additional protection from wearing a mask. So the CDC said, if you're fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. But if you're going into a store that requires a mask, you have to do that. If there are other, like if you're on an airplane, there's federal requirements on that. If you're in a big city public transport system, you've still got a mask. The messaging from the CDC on this was not ideal because it's like people only heard the part of, oh, it's okay to take a mask off now, as opposed to the part of you can only do it if you're fully vaccinated. So that left employers in a little bit of a quandary. This is what OSHA put up on its website last Monday, I believe. They said, we're going to pay attention to what the CDC has said, but we're reviewing our guidance from January 29. You can see that down there on this little cut and paste that I did from their website. So we're kind of waiting for more information from OSHA on what to do about the mask issue. That's federal OSHA. If you talk to the North Carolina OSHA and the South Carolina OSHA, as I have done in the last few days, what they will tell you is the guidance on masks, which basically is based on what OSHA put out on January 29, has not changed. They say that you've still got to comply with the general duty clause. And they say every employer should just do a hazard assessment of its work site and consider the number of positive cases in your work site, the number of positive cases in your county, the size of your facility, the nature of work, blah, 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 in deciding whether you can drop the mask mandate for your employees and still be in compliance with the general duty clause. And the answer is going to be different from employer to employer. Like say you've got an engineering firm with a lot of very highly educated people, very responsible people, and that pretty much all of them are fully vaccinated. That's one kind of situation. Versus if you've got a plant with 2,000 or 3,000 workers where it's really hard to collect the information about who is fully vaccinated or not. And even some companies that have multiple plants, they might have a plant in one state where the vaccination rate is very high and another plant in another state where the vaccination rate is very low, where they could have a different policy, same company, but a different work site. So, employer policy options are either to keep requiring the mask, which seems to be what the vast majority of employers are doing now, versus dropping it for people who are fully vaccinated. And then that raises the issue of how you figure out if somebody's vaccinated. And you basically have to be very careful about asking for the information and keeping it in a way that doesn't violate the strict confidentiality requirements of the ADA. And with that, I will turn it over to Bridget. Bridget?
Oh, thanks, David. All right, so we're going to work through now some of the disability-related and discrimination issues going on here. And so I want to talk a little bit just about the overlap between the Americans with Disabilities Act and the COVID-19 pandemic. So the big picture is that the ADA continues to apply during the pandemic, and it also doesn't prevent employers from following CDC and other public health recommendations. And so there's a very important for everyone to be familiar with section on the EEOC website that we've got a little clip from here that's called What You Should Know About COVID-19 and the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act and other laws. And so that's got a lot of good information on it. It is important to remember that that's guidance and not regulations. And so it doesn't quite have the same weight that it would if it had been through the rulemaking process, but it is good information. It's also, as we're going to see as we work through it a little bit, it's a little less clear than we might like in light of how long this has been going on and how much information is available now to work from. All right, so let's kind of just review some basics about the Americans with Disabilities Act so that we make sure that we're all on the same page about the background here. So the first part of the ADA is that it prohibits discrimination against a qualified individual with a disability. So you're going to see that in these slides as a QIWD. So that's a qualified individual with a disability. So that's someone who, with or without reasonable accommodation, can perform the essential functions of a job. And so that's a lot of terms of art. And, you know, we work through those in particular circumstances with individual employees. So the other thing to remember about the ADA is that disability is broadly defined. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act was most recently amended with respect to its definition of disability, that definition got really expanded. And so we don't fight as much anymore over whether someone is disabled. Now we pay more attention to how are they impaired and what accommodations might let them work with that impairment. And so we used to spend a lot of time on whether the disability met the definition. We spend a lot less time on that anymore. So disability includes a whole lot of things, but it does not include a generalized fear of infection, including with COVID-19. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out when we deal with particular employees with specific kinds of anxiety disorders, and whether their existing anxiety disorder interacting with their fear of COVID may have some protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so that's where this very individualized analysis comes into play. We don't want to be taking away too broad a conclusions under any kind of ADA analysis. It could also include COVID if there are significant symptoms. We know that people experience COVID very differently. Some people have it for a long time, and it can have long lingering effects. And then some people have underlying conditions that make people more susceptible to COVID, and so they may need to take additional precautions, particularly if those underlying conditions may impact their ability or desire to be vaccinated. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a few minutes. So the ADA also prohibits conducting medical examinations and making medical inquiries unless they are job-related and consistent with business necessity, or there's a reasonable belief that the employee poses a direct threat to him or herself or others. So this gets a little tricky with respect to COVID because COVID-19 infections meet the direct threat standard, and so that's good to know. But what we also know about COVID-19 infections is that you can be infected and asymptomatic, or you can be pre-symptomatic. So people have been walking around with COVID and not knowing they have COVID throughout the pandemic, either because they're people who will never have symptoms and would never have symptoms, or because their symptoms hadn't appeared yet. And so we don't know from looking at an employee whether or not they're infected at that moment unless they've recently had a positive test. And so that makes things a little bit more complicated. There's also, with respect to the ADA, some very strict confidentiality requirements. A lot of people refer to these as Hipaa requirements. Technically, Hipaa doesn't apply to employers quite the same way people think it does, but it's the same category of kind of basic health care, privacy information. Medical information has to be kept confidential. And this is just a quick tip, it should be in a separate file from your regular personnel files. So if you're keeping medical information combined with other personnel files, that's something you're going to want to split out. And that will include if you decide to ask for information and keep records about which of your employees are vaccinated. That belongs in the medical part of your file that needs to be kept restricted so that other people can't access it. So other parts about the ADA that are important to this kind of thinking through how the ADA interacts with COVID-19 is that the ADA requires a reasonable accommodation for a qualified individual with a disability once an employee makes a request for one, unless it poses an undue hardship. And so the important parts here are what are an accommodation and what are an undue hardship. And so an accommodation is any change to the work environment that enables the employee to perform the essential functions of a position. This is where job descriptions can be really important, because they are hopefully documents that you've created before there's a request for an accommodation that outline for the employee and for anybody else, like a court or a government agency that might be looking at this job. They outline what is the essential function of this position, or what are the essential functions as the company views them. And so you can develop an understanding with the employee before you're dealing with an accommodation, when you have an effective job description in place. And so this is a good time, if you haven't revisited your job descriptions or you don't have any job descriptions in place, to go ahead and look at those, either putting them in place or making sure that they're accurate. So once an employee requests accommodation, then the employer and the employee have to engage in what's called the interactive process. And so you can't just outright reject something and say, oh, that's going to cause an undue hardship, and you can't make assumptions about what might or might not work. You need to engage with the employee, and there should be some back and forth. It's important to remember in that process, you're not necessarily required to provide the accommodation the employee prefers. There may be other accommodations that will work, and one of the things that we may run into here when we talk about work from home is whether there are other ways that someone might be able to be accommodated other than working from home, even if they would prefer to. It is okay to exclude an employee whose disability poses a direct threat that can't be eliminated or reduced with a reasonable accommodation. And so that's where we start to get into what are the reasonable accommodations that might work here to eliminate the direct threat. And here the direct threat that we're dealing with is COVID infection. And then the other thing that we kind of are grappling with but has not been clearly defined as a direct threat is potential COVID infection. So if someone is not vaccinated and has not been recently tested for COVID, they are someone who is potentially infected and you may think of as a direct threat, but may not actually meet the definition of a direct threat under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that can make things complicated. So the last piece to kind of think about here and sort of have in the back of our minds as we're working through this analysis is the definition of undue hardship. And so undue hardships require an individualized assessment of current circumstances that show that the specific accommodation that you're looking at would cause significant difficulty or expense. And there's a list of factors that we work through with that I'm going to, for brevity's sake, not cover in detail here, but they look at sort of the size of the employer and, relative expense compared to how big your company is and how much money is in your budget, those sorts of things. So it's not the same for a very small business as it might be for a very large business, and it can vary based on the requirements of a position as well. All right, so the next thing we're going to kind of work through, and I think this is probably the big ticket item for a lot of employers, is can or should we require employees to take a COVID-19 vaccine? And so I will tell you that the employment bar is talking about this, and the answer is going to be for a while, I think what lawyers often answer, which is it depends. So many healthcare, long-term care, and child care employers are already requiring vaccinations. I'm sure some of you are already requiring vaccinations against seasonal flu, tuberculosis, other kinds of diseases. But the big difference with the COVID-19 vaccinations that are available and other vaccinations is that the COVID-19 vaccination is emergency use authorization by the FDA. And so that means that it's not been through quite the same rigorous protocols that many of the other vaccines that people require have been. And so some of the requirements and some of the restrictions on what healthcare providers tell people, even when you receive your COVID-19 vaccination, the healthcare provider is going to tell you that you're taking this vaccine voluntarily. And so that becomes a little tricky if you're there because your employer required you to be there. So there's some distinctions and differences here. We think it's going to be easiest for employers of workers who are in close proximity to each other and in close proximity to customers who could potentially contract or infect each other with COVID-19 to show that it's okay for them to require a vaccination, assuming, again, that you're providing reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because there are some employees who will have disabilities that would prevent them from receiving vaccinations, either based on allergies or based on other kinds of immune diseases. It's not a huge range that as I understand it, but there are some. And we also don't know what healthcare providers are going to say about specific patients until we get into the interactive process with them. You also need to keep in mind state and local anti-discrimination laws. Those are going to vary. And in North and South Carolina, we don't have a lot of current law that we need to worry about here, but it is something to keep an eye on. Reminder again to keep any information about vaccinations in separate medical files. And then the important thing about the EEOC guidance is that it assumes that some employers will require the vaccine, but it doesn't actually authorize requiring the vaccine. And so that's kind of a hole in the guidance there that we're still working through. Okay, so I see there's a question here about mandatory testing, and so I am going to address that here in a few minutes. So if you hang tight, I will get to that question. Okay, so these numbers up here in this slide are referring to that EEOC guidance, what you need to know about COVID-19 that I referred to at the beginning, that you can find on the EEOC website. And so, can we require vaccines? And the answer here is possibly. So the vaccine under the Americans with Disabilities Act is not a medical exam, and so asking for proof of a vaccination is not necessarily a medical inquiry. So you can ask your employees whether they've been vaccinated. You can ask to see a copy of their vaccination record. You can make a copy of their vaccination record, and then you can keep it in their file. Now, as David alluded to earlier, the OSHA is still saying you should not be treating vaccinated and unvaccinated employees differently, but we expect that guidance may change here shortly. And also, OSHA says that you can follow the CDC guidance, which clearly indicates that vaccinated employees no longer need to wear masks under some circumstances. And so we've got to work through those issues. So the big ticket kind of thing to avoid here is if you're asking people if they've been vaccinated, make sure you're not asking follow-up questions that would elicit information about disabilities, like why haven't you been vaccinated? Now, if you put a requirement in place or offer incentives to be vaccinated, employees may tell you why they're not vaccinated and work through the reasonable accommodation process that way, but you don't want to put it out there, the question, and elicit that information unless you're in the reasonable accommodation discussion and they've disclosed that they want a reasonable accommodation. Pre-screening questions can also implicate disability-related inquiries. So if you set up vaccinations at work and then have a provider that you brought in that you require employees to use or require employees to use if they haven't already been vaccinated, then that person might be viewed as your agent. And there are some pre-screening questions they have to ask before they give the vaccine. Those are disability-related inquiries. And so if that person is standing in as your representative, that can create some issues. And so you're best off, if you're going to require vaccines, letting employees decide where to go get it themselves. So you're also going to need to consider reasonable accommodation for pregnant workers, for employees with disabilities like we talked about, and then also employees with religious objections to vaccines. Now, based on what we know from past vaccine experiences, there are not very many religions that have objections to vaccines, but there are some. It's a minority. And that's a different process and analysis than under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we're focusing on the ADA in this presentation because it's a much more common analysis to work through, but you do need to keep in mind that if someone raises a religious objection, that you should work through that process with the employee as well. Similar, but not exactly the same as under the ADA. So if the other thing to keep in mind is if a vaccination requirement screens out qualified individuals with disabilities, then the employer has to show that the unvaccinated employee who may or may not have COVID-19 at the moment would pose a direct threat. And so that's where this gets a little bit dicey and more complicated. So that, as you can see, this is just not a clear-cut, easy answer for employers in this situation. It's something that you really have to think through the pros and cons for your particular workforce and the particular circumstances that your employees are in. Okay, so here's the other question. Should you be requiring employees to take a COVID-19 vaccination? You are not required or even encouraged to vaccinate workers yourself. So you're required to allow workers to go get vaccinated if they want to. You're required, if you make it a requirement, you may be required to pay people to go get it, though not necessarily. There are some incentives the government has put in place to help you encourage vaccinating workers. And under Osha, encouraging vaccination, as David discussed, is a good idea. The other thing to think through is, since we know masks have been very effective at slowing down the spread and stopping the spread in workplaces, is it necessary to protect your employees or customers? So if you're going to require the vaccine, you really need to think through, well, have masks worked in our workplace so far? And if they have, then is, going through this vaccine debate with some employees who may be resistant to becoming vaccinated, if you had issues with people wearing masks, some of those same people are likely to be resistant to receiving a vaccine. You may receive even more pushback from your employees that are not based necessarily on disability or religion, but on political philosophy or other just objections that are not as easy to deal with, and as far as just the clear enough guidance about what to do. So the other thing is, if employees refuse the vaccine, they could definitely raise some collective bargaining kinds of issues if you have a group of employees together who are raising concerns about the vaccine. And then you can also have some OSHA Act issues, as David alluded to earlier. So one other quick reminder for North and South Carolina employers, we like to work this in wherever we can. The National Labor Relations Act does apply to your workforce, even if you don't have a union. So Section 7 of the NLRA protects employees who collectively object to a term or condition of employment, as long as they're not supervisors or managers. And so you may run into issues with the NLRA and the National Labor Relations Board that enforces that act if you have employees coming together to say, we don't want to be vaccinated and you can't make us, or you shouldn't make us. So that's something important to keep in mind. And then the other thing David already talked through was the OSHA retaliation protection. So we did have earlier guidance from OSHA in connection with the H1N1 pandemic that employers generally could require employees to take vaccines. And so if you are going to make that a requirement in your workforce, that's definitely a letter you may want to point to and rely on. It's not as clear whether that H1N1 guidance would be sufficient for the COVID-19 vaccination currently under those EUAs. Okay, so if you're considering a mandatory policy, you need to have a plan in place for how you're going to handle requests for accommodations. You might want to already have forms in place. You may want to ask the medical provider or religious leader to provide a certification explaining the basis for the request. Most employers, especially larger employers, medium-sized and large employers, already have some kind of accommodation system in place. It's important to educate your supervisors and managers, who might be the first person to receive a request for accommodation, how to funnel that and where to direct employees. And then you need to prepare for the interactive process, and also prepare for it to really be interactive and not to sort of set up rules and gateways that are hard and fast so that it's not really interactive and you're not actually working through things. This needs to be an individualized inquiry. Possible accommodations to think about for people who cannot be vaccinated: if you're requiring vaccinations or making different choices for employees who are vaccinated or not, is additional personal protective equipment. Can you modify their duties? Can you modify where they're working? Can you transfer them? And so you really want to work through, if you're going to require vaccines, how are you going to handle all of these issues? The other thing that you can do is encourage employees to become vaccinated through communication, education. You can offer incentives. I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. That's also a little bit tricky. And you can also work through just some, good old-fashioned education. And so I have a screenshot here of Dolly Parton, who helped to fund the Moderna vaccine, and you can go find this on YouTube. It's cute. She rewrote part of her Jolene song to talk about vaccines and kind of gives people a hard time about not getting it soon enough. And it's, it's a little hokey, it's a little funny, and it's easy to pop that YouTube link into an email and send it around to your employees, and just, people can watch it if they want. Maybe it's persuasive to somebody, maybe it's not. But you can see here Dolly had the right wardrobe for her vaccine. She had a cold shoulder dress on, so she didn't have to remove any clothing to be on the YouTube getting her vaccine. So that's one thing that you might consider. Are there ways that you can kind of work in encouraging people that aren't such a serious, strong debate about politics, but may make people smile or laugh? My kids sing this vaccine song now that they've heard it all the time, so they like it better than the original. All right, so what about offering incentives? So the EEOC had some guidance on whether we could offer incentives to take vaccines, and it was withdrawn with a bunch of other guidance with the change in administrations. And so now we have a promise that there will be some guidance coming. There was an April 15th memo. I note that that was a month and 11 days ago now, so it's not coming quickly. And they have not given us an estimated time of when we can expect this guidance to come, but the guidance is coming. And so that makes it tricky for employers who are trying to figure out what incentives can we offer. Is continued employment going to be seen as an incentive as under a requirement? I think it's unlikely that that's going to be the case, since the guidance the EEOC has already put out sort of assumes that some employers will be requiring the vaccine. But this is something to really keep an eye on. If you have a incentive program or a requirement in place, you want to know as soon as this happens, and we will be keeping our eye on it as well and be issuing an alert, I'm sure, in a timely manner once it comes out. All right, so what about requiring employees to return to the workplace? So telecommuting, as we all know who've been dealing with employment law and HR even before the pandemic, is a reasonable accommodation for a qualified individual with a disability if the essential functions of the job can be done from home, and if it actually has some, relationship to the impairment that the person has. And so I like working better from home is not enough, but somewhere between that and I have to work from home because I have an immune disease that won't let me be around other people even in a mask, somewhere in there's a group of people that need to be allowed to work from home. And when you've required everybody to work from home, or allowed a lot of employees to work from home because the government asked you to for a year during a pandemic, it becomes much harder to say it causes an undue hardship to let people work from home. And so I think we're going to really have to work through that analysis with people. So you want to engage in the interactive process, really think about, what do we need this person to be physically at work for? What are the essential functions of the job that can only be performed at work, or are they really things that can only be performed at work? And so this is sometimes an interaction between lawyers or HR people and management, that we know you have a philosophy that you want everybody to be here, but this person has a legitimate request for accommodation. They are a qualified individual with a disability. And so, letting them work from home is not the same as letting just anybody work from home. I'm running out of time here. Can they work from home independently without direct supervision? We're going to send these slides out so that you guys can work through them. And I'm going to kind of skip through. There's a case I was going to talk about here. The conclusion of this case is that the person who was unable to sort of establish their correct schedule and was not really effectively working from home, the company was able to require them to come back to work without facing an ADA. Well, they faced a lawsuit, but they won the lawsuit. So they won summary judgment. And in a case brought by the EEOC, though, which is nothing to sneeze at, that's an experience most people don't want to go through. So we've got a list here of considerations for you to think through if employees can work from home. And then I saw there was a question about requiring mandatory testing for all employees. You absolutely can require tests for employees. There are restrictions on which tests you can provide. That test needs to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. And so because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that it's so contagious, currently you can definitely require employees who are coming into work to be tested. You can administer it on your own. You can require people to go get it other places. And then there are some CDC guidelines around what kinds of tests that you can use. The antibody tests cannot be used because of accuracy and reliability issues with those tests that, as far as I'm aware of, have not been resolved. And you also want to make sure, as always, when we're doing medical information with employees, you want to obtain written consent. You can also do temperature checks. You can have people answer COVID-19 questions. I'm sure a lot of you have these in place. It's still something you might want to have in place for a while, particularly since we're in states that have less than half of the adult population vaccinated so far. And so until we get a much higher number of people vaccinated, it's still going to be a good idea to be screening people for COVID, particularly people if you're not checking to see which of your workforce is vaccinated. Can you require them to pass a COVID-19 test? Not if they're working from home. You can't ask about family members, and so that makes it a little tricky too. That's because of the genetic, GINA, I can't remember the genetic information. I can't remember what the NA are. It is okay to ask employees if they've had contact with anyone who has COVID-19 symptoms. And so some of this is guidance that we've been working through for a while with people, but it's important to keep in mind that even though we have some new guidance from the CDC on masks, even though there's some new Osha guidance that we expect to come out, that, we need to be looking at, in the geography where we are and with our particular employee populations, what is the actual vaccinated to unvaccinated risk that we're looking at here. And so I'm gonna wrap up here, and I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody wants to put any more questions in the chat. You do want to keep in mind the confidentiality requirements and that all of this is medical information that you'll need to keep. And so we'll send the slide deck out. It's got a little bit more good information in there in case you want to flip through that. And David and I are both available if you have questions and want to reach out to us separately. We would be delighted to talk to you. Thank you guys for your time and attention today, and we look forward to seeing and talking to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you for everybody who joined us today. If you've got follow-up questions, feel free to send us an email. Since I don't see any more questions in the chat, I think we'll go ahead and conclude this presentation. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.